What's up, everybody? This is Derek with Action A Go Go doing a Big Trouble in Little China retrospective. This is something I've been meaning to do for a while, and instead of writing an article, I decided to do a live stream. And in honor of this being an 80s film, I figured I'd give us a little bit of 80s flair here. And just to give you some updates, I watched the Blu-ray version of this movie with director's commentary on with Kurt Russell. And this recording was from the early 2000s, it sounded like. So this is like a 20-year-old conversation between Kurt Russell and John Carpenter. And you can really feel the love that they have for each other. It's a great conversation. But just to get into it, the reason I wanted to do this was because I've just been hankering for 80s stuff recently. Just to give you another introduction, I run a website called Action A Go Go. We've got merch. Some links going to be available down below. You can also follow us on Action A Go Go, Instagram and Twitter. On Instagram and Twitter, you can go to our website. You can go to our merch store. There's going to be a link below. And I'm also an author. I wrote a couple of novels. There's a couple of interviews with me in regards to my novels on YouTube. Feel free to check those out if you want me to get a little bit more personal. But yeah, the books are The Vicious Game and Knuckle Crack Bone. They're both available on Amazon. Sorry, I'm doing this off the cuff, so might be starting and stopping a little bit, but want to give you guys a good show and talk about one of my favorite adventure films, Big Trouble in Little China. Big Trouble in Little China was a movie that I watched in my childhood a lot, had a big effect on me. And it's one of those movies where I just discovered it on Betamax, believe it or not, watched it quite a bit. And of course, it was just on television. It played a lot on television. And so my stepmother had a basement full of Betamax videos. She basically bought a bunch of Betamax videos from a store that went out of business or wanted to unload its inventory. And there was all sorts of crazy stuff I watched back then. But Big Trouble in Little China always stood out. It's such a fun movie. It's an adventure movie. It's right up there for me with Temple of Doom, at least in terms of atmosphere and sort of je ne sais quoi, this adventure exploring a different culture, even though it's technically an American culture, I guess, a Chinese American culture, so to speak. And also Buckaroo Banzai, Adventures of Buckaroo Banzai. It's one of those 80s films that's very 80s. It's very wacky. It ducks and dives when you expect it to just play it straight. And it's very comical. It's very funny. It's a very funny film, along with the action that you do get. So that's just my experience with it, just to sort of dive in. I remember being a kid watching this movie, watching Kurt Russell, the supporting cast, who I'm also going to go over later in the broadcast. And it was just so fun, so entertaining, always kept me occupied. One of those movies where I always watch to the end, and it's just so beautiful and so fun. It's a very fun movie. Now, just to get into it, I want to talk about the time this movie came out. And a lot of this came from the conversation between John Carpenter and Kurt Russell. So my experience was I was a kid. I loved the movie. And just to give you a quick synopsis. So basically, Dennis Dunn plays, hold on real quick, I want to get the names right, plays opposite Kurt Russell, a.k.a. Jack Burton, as he is called in the film. And he's basically waiting to pick up his future wife from the airport. And they get into a bet. Jack Burton is a truck driver. He's just your average 80s, your average 80s working stiff hero, which showed up a lot in 80s films. And they get into a gambling altercation. Then they end up teaming up. And Jack Burton takes Dennis Dunn to actor Dennis Dunn, who's the opposite of Jack Burton in this movie, takes them to the airport. And then they run into Kim Catrell, who is a reporter. And then Dennis Dunn's wife gets robbed. Basically, she gets kidnapped. And then hilarity ensues. The rest of the movie is basically them trying to find her, and they get into this deep criminal enterprise with that's involved in magic and illegal trade and smuggling and human trafficking. I mean, it's actually quite a bit. But Dennis Dunn plays Wang Chi. So it's Jack Burton, played by Kurt Russell, Wang Chi, played by Dennis Dunn. Great performance by Dennis Dunn. Don't see a lot of him after this movie. Kim Cattrall plays Gracie Law. She is the reporter, sort of pushing the plot forward along the way. And you also have the other wife is Susie Pye, who also don't really see a lot of her after this movie. This is one of the movies where she was in and then sort of falls off the map, or maybe has a career, but you don't really hear too much about her from there. So anyway, the big bad is played by James Hong, who has a legacy in entertainment going back to the 1950s. He's probably most famous for this movie, along with his role in Blade Runner, as well as Wayne's World 2. He plays the love interest father in Wayne's World 2. Great performance, very funny movie. Of course, if you haven't watched Wayne's World, those are both great movies. But it's just incredible, his legacy, going real far back. But anyway, that's the story. So Jack Burton, Wang Chi, going after Wang Chi's wife, trying to save her. James Hong is the bad guy. Egg Shen played by Victor Wong, is someone who helps them along the way. He's like a Chinese sorcerer who helps them fight the forces of evil. And I mean, I don't want to spoil too much of it. I mean, feel free to watch the movie and come back to this if you want to get some more pointers. This is really for people who've watched the movie. But the plot is your typical 80s working class adventure. It's in San Francisco. It's in, that sort of California Chinese American community. And I hope I'm getting that right. Should be that area. It feels like it. But either way, the movie is so fun. It's so fun, so effervescent. And listening to Kurt Russell and John Carpenter go over the film is just incredible, because it's really emblematic of the time it is from. So the movie came out in like 1985 or so, right in the heart of the 80s, like really dead center of that era of films. And for John Carpenter, like I don't think John Carpenter is appreciated enough, because I think he's had a resurgence in his career, but John Carpenter, he reinvented the horror film with Halloween. He really laid the groundwork for the modern horror film. And that occurred in 1978. And he had a bunch of great movies before then too. But with Halloween in 1978, he reinvented the horror film and sort of kicked off, in my opinion, the 80s generation, like with the soundtrack, with the feel, with the violence, that he brought to the table. So that was sort of how he got kicked off. And then he makes this rogues gallery of films. So Halloween, there's a couple in between, but then he does Escape from New York with Kurt Russell, era-defining film. Like, that is, if you watch Escape from New York, we're talking maximum 80s here. This movie really sets the tone for a lot, in my opinion. I know there's like a feel with the technology going on overall. This is where you get that 80s feel coming into a lot of movies, basically synthesizers, various computer graphics, like that really colorful, basic, angular computer graphics coming in. And that all starts defining the era that we're going to get. Then he does Christine, again, seminal, generational defining movie for Christine. Starman, very influential sci-fi film with Jeff Bridges. He's literally an alien who falls to Earth and gets wrapped up. I'm going to call it a conspiracy, but all sorts of cool stuff happens in that movie. Really, really excellent sci-fi film. And from there, actually, I skipped one. I skipped The Thing. Oh my God, The Thing. All right, so just to go back, The Fog, Escape from New York, The Thing, again, redefine sci-fi horror with that movie. That movie is probably one of the greatest horror or science fiction films ever made, period. And then you have Christine, car comes alive and starts killing people, another generational defining movie. And then Starman, Jeff Bridges, amazing sci-fi film. And then Big Trouble in Little China, which, 86, okay, 1986, technically it came out, but again, right in the heart of the 80s, very well done film. But what's interesting about this and why I bring up this time frame of films, Big Trouble in Little China is completely different than pretty much every film I just mentioned. It has mystical elements to it. There's some of that in the other films, but Big Trouble in Little China, completely different than Starman, like really completely different than Starman, completely different than Christine, completely different than The Thing. And Escape from New York is its own beast, right? Like it's this dystopian, crazy action film that some people say is coming true. And then you have The Fog. I've never watched the original Fog. I think it has to do with the Stephen King novel. But again, Big Trouble in Little China is completely different than Halloween. But the point being, he's able to make this like crazy, fun adventure film. After doing all these like very much more serious, violent, atmospheric work. So he shows a lot of verisimilitude, or well, not sure that's the right word. He shows a lot of plasticity in his abilities to be able to do different things, master different aspects of movie making, because this movie is very funny. Big Trouble in Little China is very funny, and it's very different than being able to make a funny film is very different than making a horror film and whatnot. The timing and all that's different, but it shows a lot of plasticity in terms of his abilities and ability to tackle new and different material. And it's also fairly original. Like you have your Indiana Joneses, you have other adventure films of this time, but even amongst other films, it's unique in terms of what it's doing, in terms of how it plays the main character. And there's some stories there here. So just to dive in. So Kurt Russell and John Carpenter have this bromance that brews. They do Escape from New York together. Then they do The Thing. And I think this is their last collaboration. There could be something else, but just to focus on this era, either way, he does Big Trouble in Little China with Kurt Russell. And they just make these series of films that really define the 80s, in my opinion. And it's one of those great bromances in filmmaking. To give you some other examples of what I'm talking about, you have like Christian Bale and Christopher Nolan, right? The Dark Knight movies and The Prestige. Like that's an example of a bromance. Another one is Steven Spielberg and Harrison Ford working together in the Indiana Jones films, and George Lucas and Harrison Ford to a lesser extent, because George Lucas was producing the movies that Indiana Jones was in, but they had like a trifecta bromance going. Spielberg, Lucas, Ford. But when you see these types of collaborations, it's always fascinating because the creativity is there, they're in synergy, the trust is there, and I think everybody involved is just confident enough to push it to the next level. And they do, to be fair, they do reprise the roles in Escape from LA later. Like Kurt Russell reprises his role of Snake Plissken. John Carpenter's definitely involved. So they do team up again later in their careers in the 90s, particularly the mid 90s. So there's a bit of a hiatus there. But Kurt Russell's career never really diminished after this. Kurt Russell his career just kept going up and up. John Carpenter's career sort of trailed off in the 90s, so to speak. At least his career as a director, he's definitely doing stuff. But after the 80s or mid 90s, you don't hear too much from John Carpenter anymore. And I don't know, probably a reason for that. Some of his later works I wasn't a huge fan of. But that's beside the point. Again, focusing on this movie, it's really interesting hearing them talk about it. So you have John Carpenter, Kurt Russell, old friends, and this director's commentary is unique in that, so when you have director's commentary, particularly from this era, sometimes the director's getting really technical, and it's almost like a film class. Like they're talking about how they got the lighting, how they got this, how they did that, how they shot the scene. And it's really fun. It's really amazing, to hear a director talk about their craft. When you have actors doing the talking, it's usually completely different. Like actors, contrary to popular belief, unless they're really involved in directing, producing, they're more journeymen. They show up and they leave. Like I think Alec Baldwin famously said, or maybe John Travolta. Oh, I think this was Alec Baldwin quote. Actors are like plumbers, right? That you show up for a job and then you leave. A director is really the person responsible for everything else, or at least involved in the editing, the shooting, of course, the script, all that stuff. They've got a big influence on how the movie's made, much more so than the actors, even though actors can bring a lot of juice and be involved in the producing or directing. These things have a malleability to them, or these roles can be malleable depending on how much power is given at it. Someone's given it at a certain point. But anyway, with this conversation, it's unique because you get a mix of those things. For instance, when I watched the Conan the Barbarian movie with director's commentary and Arnold Schwarzenegger's commentary, you had John Milius. Every time John Milius talked, the director of that movie, he was like, oh, and there's the reason behind this scene. Conan is thinking about his revenge. He's contemplating his future. He's a warrior. And then you hear Arnold talk, and he goes, yeah, I get to hold the sword. I get to swing the sword. I had to learn how to use the sword. And that's all. But you hear, so for instance, John Milius is talking about the minutiae of the scenes and the storytelling. Arnold's talking about his day on set and what that was like. So that's really what I'm trying to get at here. And what we're getting with this director's commentary is really a mix of that. You have John Carpenter talking about how the movie's made. You have Kurt Russell also talking about how the movie's made, what it was like on set, and the atmosphere around it. And they actually talk about the producer of the film not liking Jack Burton's character. And the reason for that is because Jack Burton, played by Kurt Russell, the character is actually pretty incompetent in this movie. It's really interesting to see that. Like when you watch it as a kid, it's like everybody's just, things are happening and it's fine, whatever. It's all fun. But watching it as an adult, I'm really sitting here like, man, this is really Wang Chi's movie. This is really Dennis Dunn's movie. Or you have the other characters here. For instance, James Wong, who plays David Lo Pan, the big bad, he gives an amazing performance. And then you have Victor Huang playing Egg Shen, again, the sorcerer who's helping Wang Chi and Jack Burton. He's doing a great job. Like they're all much more fascinating characters than Jack Burton, but Jack Burton gets to come in clutch, so to speak. But that's also something very unique about this movie, and they actually talk about it and how that turned off the producer. And I think because it turned off the producer, this leads me to my next point. In terms of actual theatrical releases, the movie was a failure. The movie did not perform well at the box office. And one thing they talk about is so they're making the movie, producer didn't have a lot of confidence in it. They tested the movie and it tested great. And again, this is the time when movies like Indiana Jones, Buckaroo Banzai, I think they were pretty big, right? And the movie tested great. But when it came to the marketing, Kurt Russell and John Carpenter says, hey, I'm not seeing any marketing for it. No one knows about the movie. So the movie comes and goes, unfortunately, from theaters. And what happens is, what's difference between the 80s and let's say the 70s or 60s, VHS is a thing, right? And VHS is starting to become popular. Betamax was also popular, but Betamax died and VHS took over. I mentioned I watched it on Betamax. I also watched it on VHS. But the movie hits the VHS market and then it takes off. Then it becomes popular. And if you've watched the recent Blockbuster documentary on Netflix, ironically enough, you do see this phenomenon happen where the theater isn't necessarily the biggest place for the movie to be. The Blockbuster stores, the VHS release, that is its own beast and its own money-making animal that has a whole ecosystem around it that then turned into the streaming era that we know today. Of course, I think most people probably remember that, at least I do. But it's just fascinating to hear that aspect of the story because that's how I was exposed to it. That's how I knew about Big Trouble in Little China. I watched it on VHS. I watched it and enjoyed it that way and just watched it over and over again. I didn't see it in theaters. And to hear that come from the horse's mouth, from John Carpenter, from Kurt Russell, it's just fascinating to understand. And a testament to how good the movie actually was. It deserved more at the theater, but it didn't get it. So that was one aspect of the John Carpenter, Kurt Russell conversation that was really fascinating. Other stuff was just their geniality with each other. These guys obviously care about each other. They're asking about their kids. It felt like a more genial conversation than some other directors' commentaries. And you really hear the love they have for each other. Like, these guys did great work together. And other things was like, it's really interesting to hear Kurt Russell talk about other actors. Like I think Kurt Russell liked this movie a lot, liked making it. But John Carpenter was talking about he was having trouble with an actress, not denigrating her or anything, but she was having trouble with the role, and he couldn't figure out why. And Kurt Russell shows up, maybe as a favor, and says she's not confident she can do it. And what's interesting is the way he says it. He doesn't say it like jokingly. He just says she's not confident she can do it. That's the problem. And, we always watch actors, we listen to actors, but it's always interesting to see them look at it as a job, right? And I think it really talks to his mastery of his craft, where he was able to show up and actually diagnose something like that, just like that immediately. So I would really recommend getting a copy and listening to the DVD commentary or Blu-ray commentary. Really fascinating. Again, that's how I watched this. And, so I guess I already talked about their legacy sort of bit. So I guess I'm going to jump ahead to Victor Wong as Egg Shen. Victor Wong holds a special place in my heart. Again, not only for this film, he was in a couple of really good movies from the 80s and 90s. One was my favorite performance of his is Joy Luck Club. So actually, that's a good conversation to have real quick. This movie's about Chinese culture. This movie's about China, in a sense, Chinese people. And to me, that's a big reason why it's special. During the commentary, you really hear the love that John Carpenter has for Chinese cinema and Chinese culture. And that's where this movie came from. And it's really ironic because there was a controversy around it in terms of, and I think we see this a lot now, people in the Chinese American community didn't want this movie to come out because it was negative stereotypes. Now, they didn't see it. And since it's come out, I haven't seen too much hate in regards to it, so to speak. Like, Temple of Doom in some ways hasn't aged well in that sense. I'll save my commentary for Temple of Doom at another time. But I think this movie really comes from a space of love for Chinese cinema, Chinese culture, really Kung Fu filmmaking, period. Because this movie has a rogues gallery of great people in it. So using that point, this movie is a love letter to Chinese cinema, Chinese culture. And John Carpenter talks about that, talks about the roots of Chinese culture. And Kurt Russell chimes in, and it's fun hearing those filmmakers talk about it in that sense. Anyway, moving on to the cast. And another thing I love about this movie, it features a rogues gallery of great Chinese actors and Asian actors, really. I don't want to, make a blanket statement. I think some of these people are actually Japanese, but you see that in this era, we're starting to move to a new era where someone's actual background may have more of an impact on the roles they get or want to take. But that's a whole nother conversation. At the time, when I say this is really Dennis Dunn's movie, this is really James Hong's movie, this is really Victor Wong's movie, that's actually a big deal. That means something. This movie gave a lot of Asian actors work, and it really gave them time to shine. For instance, I don't really recall Dennis Dunn showing up in front of me. After, not that I matter, but I don't see his career really blossoming from here. James Hong, he's a classic character actor. Victor Wong had a great career, but after this, some of these people don't really show up too much. So it's great that they were in this movie to begin with, and had this primacy for such a fun, bombastic film. But saying that, how it's a love letter to Chinese culture, China itself, all that good stuff. Maybe a couple of tropes are in there that are a bit old school, but to me, the way they're done, it's not overly, stereotypical. It's not overly negative. It's actually quite beautiful, if you ask me. But again, just moving on to Victor Wong, Victor Wong seems to have some of a career in the 1950s, and then he shows up in the 80s, and he's just great. Victor Wong passed away in 2001, unfortunately, but he was in quite a few really good things that I wanted to mention. He was in the Joy Luck Club, which is a movie from the 90s, and it's a movie about the Chinese experience. Let me put it that way. And it's really about Chinese people, and it's a really good movie. He has a great performance in that movie. I really recommend going back and watching that movie. It's a really complex movie, deep emotions in that movie. And he was also in Tremors, classic action film, and he was in the Three Ninjas, kids film. So he bounced around a lot for a career that was pretty compact towards the end of his life. Again, God rest his soul. He went out with a bang. Had a really good legacy here, and really recommend following up on those movies as well. And then you have James Hong, who plays Lo Pan, the big bad. He's got a career stretching back to the 50s, and John Carpenter had a lot of love for him. Said he really enjoyed this role, really understand where this character's motivation was coming from, and in my opinion, he gave us one of the best bad guys from the 80s. Period. This character. It's it falls into stereotypes potentially, or you can fall into stereotypes potentially, but he really, this character he's got swagger. He's convincing, he's funny, he's persnickety, he's particular, but you almost root for him at a certain point. You understand where he's coming from, and you can really tell James Hong had a lot of love playing this role. I think he does a superb job. He gives such a fun performance. And then, of course, he was in Blade Runner as well. He was in Wayne's World. I already mentioned these things, but recommend going back and checking out his filmography, checking out these movies, checking out his presence in these movies. He's a very memorable guy, and definitely has an amazing legacy going back so far. And then you have, there's a whole rogues gallery of other people I can talk about here. But so Lo Pan is just the big baddie. But another defining feature of this film is the gosh, what do they call them? The tempers or something, or the weather people. I don't know. But it's three bad guys, the Furies maybe, but I'll call them the Furies. That might not be what they actually are. But there's one. Carter Wong plays Thunder. Peter Kwong plays Rain. James Pax plays Lightning. And these three bad guys, these three assistants to Lo Pan, are another defining feature of this movie. These guys are so fun. And the world around the movie that is built, it's like you go from what we all know as the United States, and then you get sucked into this little piece of the United States that is so mystical, so defined by these Chinese influences. And these characters really hammer that home. You have Lo Pan, but you have, Thunder, Rain, and Lightning, just as these presences that force things forward. And they have the special effects budget was really spent on these guys, and it's so defining. It's so fun. And those guys are also the link to the Kung Fu movies that really inspire this. This movie's a love letter to Kung Fu films, and it does a great job. Probably does one of the best jobs, and they actually mentioned this in the commentary, some of the best jobs of wire work until probably you get The Matrix and Crouching Tiger, Hidden Dragon, So another aspect of this, they heighten the movie. I was actually in the vicinity of Peter Kwong at the Urban Action Expo in New York years ago, when you could meet people in person. And he just had this, there's something about martial artists in general. They have this amazing energy, this presence, that alpha energy. And he had that. Those martial artists, when you meet a real martial artist, you can almost feel it in the atmosphere. It's almost electric. And this, just to go over the rest of the cast real quick, Kim Cattrall, famous for the Sex in the City, right? And she's in, I think, a show right now about country people or something, like country music. But Kim Cattrall does an amazing performance as Gracie Law. Really just bang, 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 bang. An amazing actress. Katie Burton as Margot, great supporting character. Donald Lee, another really good supporting character here. Donald Lee as Eddie Lee. Yeah, it's just different spelling there for the actual character, Eddie Lee. He's so charismatic in this movie, really fun. And just to go down, another couple of honorable mentions here. It's got Endo in it. So if you're a real action fans, know what I'm talking about. It's got Al Leong, who he had a famous role in Lethal Weapon. He tortures Mel Gibson, Riggs, tortures Riggs in Lethal Weapon, and that was famously brought back to life in the show Family Guy. So he's got a bit of a following, such a legacy, such a really amazing legacy. He was also in Die Hard. I think he's the guy who grabs the candy bar out of the case in Die Hard, and has a minor role in Big Trouble in Little China, but he's there. But Al Leong, I would love to talk to him. I would love to just pick his brain about his career going back to the 80s. Oh, God, I bet he's just been on the fly on the wall for some amazing conversations. But yeah, check out his IMDb page. Really, really fascinating stuff. What's his actual character name here? See if I can find that real quick for you. He was a Wing Kong Hatchet Man. There you go. So that's Al Leong, great guy, great legacy. And again, I'm just getting all this from IMDb. So if you want to check out IMDb, go ahead. Please do. I always do it. It's a great way to learn about actors. Even if they have minor roles, you get to see all the amazing work they do. And then you have Gerald Okamura. I think he's actually Japanese, but I was not able to get that from the biography before starting this. So that's a thing. I don't know. Respect everybody's background. But Gerald Okamura has a unique little legacy. I think he runs a show called Dragon Fest, or an event called Dragon Fest. And I think he's another one of those guys who's big in the martial arts community. There's a serious martial arts community. Stuntmen are featured in there. A lot of people know it from Joe Rogan, probably. The other side of it is the fighting side. But like stunt people, these martial artists have their own ecosystem that they're in. And this guy's a part of that ecosystem. And again, he has a legacy going back a long time. Been in a lot of good movies. He was in the original Mortal Kombat, as well as, was he in Blade Runner? He was in the Blade Runner video game. Wow. American Street Fighter. Ninja Academy. Yeah, this guy. 9.5 Ninjas. Yeah, Samurai Cop. There you go. His probably his most famous role would be Samurai Cop. He was in another movie called Day of the Warrior, something I was influenced by growing up. Samurai Cop 2, Deadly Vengeance. Yeah, this is another one of those guys. If you know action movies, if you really know action movies, you might know who some of these guys are, and you understand the legacy they have in cinema. So, what's the movie's legacy today? Well, the movie's definitely it has staying power, which is, and again, that VHS legacy. There's definitely been, if you need to get your fix or want to get your fix, want to continue the story, there are comic books featuring the title character, featuring Jack Burton. Jack Burton and I think Snake Plissken have actually sort of intermingled as well. So Kurt Russell has a little bit of a weird legacy in comics where he exists twice at the same time. But there's definitely comics you can follow. I'm not sure if we're going to get another Big Trouble in Little China movie. There's definitely news about The Rock being in like a reboot of Big Trouble in Little China, but given the political climates we're in these days, yeah, it was announced. It's on his IMDb. It's on his IMDb page. Big Trouble in Little China. I hope they do it. If they do it right, I think The Rock could nail a Jack Burton-like character. I'd like to see Kurt Russell involved. Of course, maybe John Carpenter involved somehow. But, time will tell. I'm not sure what studio this belongs to. I think it may have been 20th Century Fox, was it? They came out with the original? Gosh, I can't. Sorry, next time I'll do more homework before just hopping on. But this is just like the meandering, fun conversation I'm trying to have. Not too serious. I would really love for people to shout out in the comments. Again, feel free to explain what your experience was of this movie. Let me know. And I will see it. I will comment on it as well. I want to know what your experience is, what your fond memories are. My fond memories are being in my dad's basement fortunately, he had a big screen TV, which was back in the day meant I was looking at this monster on the screen and just watching this movie and laughing myself to death, being frozen with terror as Jack Burton was almost killed by monsters and death-defying heights and everything. God, this thing is just your classic adventure movie in that sense. And I encourage you to give it a rewatch and let me know what you think. Would love to trade memories and just enjoy this classic little film. Definitely a classic, more than 25 years old at this point. Almost as old as me, But anyway, again, Big Trouble in Little China, very much recommended. Would love to hear your thoughts. Again, Action A Go-Go on Instagram, Twitter. We have a merch store, link below. And you can also check us out at actionagogo.com. And my novels, again, I'm an author, available on Amazon. Just search Derek Scarzella. The Vicious Game, first novel. Knuckle Crack Bone, second novel. Any questions about those, feel free to hit me up. Anyway, folks, that's all I got for today. Thank you for listening. And again, definitely want to hear your thoughts. Like, subscribe, comment. Have a great weekend.